So, welcome everyone listening. This is On Tyranny. It's the radio edition of Ancient Greece Revisited. For those of you who have followed our work so far, thank you very much for starters. And then let me just introduce this little tangent of our show. As you may know, we've been engaged in literally revisiting ancient Greece, in trying to rediscover the original, the inceptual vision of ancient Greece. And we've been digging deep into the history, the philosophy, the religion, which you can find on our YouTube show, Ancient Greece Revisited. And we decided to go off on a little branch because, as of late, and whichever side you actually take on these subjects, I'm sure if you're interested enough in what's happening in the world to be watching our show, you probably agree that the world is going slightly mad. And we're trying to understand why. And it would be a shame if, for all the philosophy, we could not apply it to what is happening now. Obviously, we're thinking about things like the American elections and perhaps even most importantly, the COVID-19 crisis, a crisis of mismanagement, at least as much as a medical emergency. It seems, at least in aspect, and we're always willing to be proven otherwise in a debate, but it seems that there's something going on in the global state of affairs, in the global state of things. It's not an exaggeration to at least theorize whether there's a global tyranny on the rise, a new planetary society of top-down controls. We need to understand it before we even take it a stand. And so we decided to inaugurate this podcast. So far, it's going to be voice only, at least for the first few episodes, and invite philosophers, academics, artists, and people who have this knowledge. We have the knowledge that we're looking for to understand what is going on with our culture. So, in this first episode of On Tyranny, I am very pleased to introduce you to a man whom I have so far met online, who goes by the very interesting name, the Athenian Stranger. Stranger, welcome to our show. It's a great pleasure to have you. I would just love for you to introduce yourself. Who are you? What has your work been so far that brought you here?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me on this on your show. This is a very big honor for me. Um, my my immediate work, I specialize in classical political philosophy, and by that I mean almost exclusively the works of Plato and Aristotle. Um, the pseudonym that I use, the Athenian Stranger, is the primary character in Plato's longest dialogue. I chose that particular title for a number of reasons, one of which is that I wrote my PhD dissertation on an individual who wrote an outstanding book on Plato's laws, Seth Benedetti. He was uh, possibly one of the greatest students of Leo Strauss. Uh, he's very, very difficult to understand often, but he's always very rewarding to read. So uh, that's essentially my immediate background as things stand.
Great. And how did you begin? Because from a Greek standpoint, we are in Greece, and obviously we have a intimate connection with ancient Greece, which just has to be different from anyone else's, because we feel. Mostly rightfully, I would say, and perhaps we exaggerate sometimes, but there is a good basis for us to feel the descendants of these people. So it's very interesting when we see the rest of the world being engaged with this culture of ancient Greece. And so, just to take you back when perhaps you graduated school, what was that which drew you to ancient Greece? Did you go straight for that, or did you study something else, or what what was that mind of yours at 17, 18 that drew you?
Well, originally I was in a mathematics PhD program, and my field of research in mathematics was essentially the foundations, the theoretical foundations of mathematics in the form of set theory, logic, and that becomes very, very philosophical very quickly. And a lot of times, mathematicians themselves will just stay buried in the math. They don't really like getting too involved into the philosophy. And so I found myself taking a number of philosophy courses instead. And I just happened to be at a university that had some of the greatest uh, scholars of Leo Strauss teaching philosophy. And the more of the classes that I took with them, the more I discovered that a lot of the deepest writings on things like the philosophy of mathematics come from a number of Strauss' students and his best friends, most especially Jacob Klein, who wrote a book on the origins of symbolic logic and mathematics, which is essentially it's just one long commentary on how Plato, more than others, uh, talks or explores more than others how the notion of mathematics was understood by Plato, and it just
Yeah,
became very yeah, it just became very interesting.
Yeah, that is fascinating in its own right, and I'd like to dive deeper because I guess my path so far is somewhat related. I did not get as deep as you did on the PhD level, but I did study computer science on a graduate level, and I've worked ever since, in software engineering, and right at the apex of my phase, I guess, when I was 25, 26, around then, that I was, let's say, most in love with computer science. I got into, I also wanted to find the theoretical foundations of this science, which takes one back at least in the early 20th century with people. Obviously, Alan Turing is the man who's credited the most for having invented the modern computer. But he was part of an entire effort of mathematicians, logicians, and philosophers, Bernard Russell being one of them, who were trying to find exactly what you were trying to find so many years later, the core foundations of math. Famously, I think Bernard Russell wrote an entire book where I guess the very layman's description is that he tried to prove that 1 plus 1 equals 2, which sounds it's so. And this effort failed.
Do you mind if I just sort of pause
yeah,
right there,
please.
because something that I think a lot of your listeners will be happy to hear is that question, 1 plus 1 equals 2, is literally the most famous question, or it's supposed to be the most famous question, according to the Platonic dialogues, that Socrates himself ever asked. That was the one question that stopped him dead in his tracks uh, in his dialogue, the Phaedo, where he's explaining his own little autobiography to his closest friends on his deathbed, about how he himself uh, sort of went from uh, what we would call a natural scientist.
Yes, a physics major. He switched.
Yes, yes, I like that, his switch.
So we have three in the party. We have myself, you, and Socrates. It's very interesting. Yeah, yeah, great company, I think. Who went, yeah, to study, and I guess, yeah, this is crucial. How the difference, because I guess in our culture privileges the natural sciences tremendously, physics, a physics professor is the people that today we ask the same questions that we would ask a philosopher, like where does everything come from? What does it all mean? And unfortunately, they give very frustrating answers because modern physics kind of has no meaning, at least in the human sense. So,
Yeah.
and I always felt this gap in the modern sciences, but they have gripped our minds so much that it's taboo to even question them. So I guess just going in that transition, like when Socrates was transitioning, and I think there's a great book called The Socratic Turn that describes exactly
Dustin
what,
Sabel.
yeah, and it's very interesting that it's on the last of Plato's dialogue. In other words, the last, sorry, not the last of Plato's dialogues, the last episode of Socrates' life, just before he was given the hemlock and got executed. He does this little recap, and he goes back into his life, and he explains how he switched majors. So in your life, just what is the climate? I mean, if you were almost at the apex of knowledge in the modernist sense, the technocratic sense, and then you gave that away for something you consider deeper.
Yeah, you really nailed it just now when you talked about how we've somehow found ourselves in this interesting position where we've handed uh, the public right to answer the most important questions over to the physicists. That Strauss and Alan Bloom, his student, talk a lot about this. They point out how modern science is essentially a blind giant. It doesn't know how to answer questions of right and wrong and good and evil. It simply knows how to throw very powerful technology at these answers. And uh, the most dangerous aspect about this is exactly what we see in Plato's Apology, where Socrates describes what landed him in the court of the Athenians. And Seth Benedetti describes it as the overreach of partial knowledge. So Socrates goes around and he's asking the poets, the politicians, and the technicians, what is virtue? What are the good things that we should value? And because they're considered to be experts in their respective fields, they always attempt to expand that expertise into realms that they know nothing about. And so, hence the overreach of partial knowledge.
Yeah, and we see it so much because I mean now it seems that the planet is going through a different phase, but for a long time, you had this movement of the new atheists. You had Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and it was very frustrating for me to see how these people used arguments that were very old and have been answered in history, but they used these arguments in an audience that was somewhat ignorant, perhaps, of the history of these arguments, and they kind of it seemed like they blasted everyone away, but they could only do so because the audience was already prepared to accept the scientist over the philosopher.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
And you gave up, let's say, the scientist in favor of the philosopher. Did you have people advising you otherwise? You could be working, I don't know, in Silicon Valley in some machine learning technology, trying to spy on everyone. But then you went on, yeah.
Yeah, I actually had both the professors in the math department as well as a number of professors in the philosophy department telling me that I was making a huge mistake. They told me, they said, look, finish everything in mathematics, get your mathematics PhD, and then just read philosophy on your own time. Which I understand that, and I have great respect for people that do that. I know people who do that. But for me, I recognized enough that my background was not nearly sufficient to even know how to study the books on my own. And so
Mm.
I needed I needed that guidance in the classroom. I needed to spend a number of years studying from these people uh, before I was really able to uh, learn. The way I describe it is people have to learn how to read. We think that because we can read, that we know how to read. And what we fail to understand is that we need to take a very humble approach when reading the greatest authors in the Western world. And we need to understand that it's very possible that we don't already know how to read them because they're that far ahead of us. And so oftentimes we need a lot of guidance. And I find that particularly true with Plato and Aristotle in particular, because they are writing. They literally are writing with a multi what I like to think of as a multi-layered audience in mind.
Mm.
It's much like the Bible. There are there are people who are going to get a surface impression of the reading, and then they're going to realize there are going to be people, a subset of that group, that realize, okay, I think there's a little bit more being said here, so let's look a little bit closer.
Yeah, and bringing everything together, you mentioned the name of Leo Strauss, who's definitely someone who has influenced myself personally and our show. And he was one of the very few to notice that just like it happened in your life, in my life, in Socrates' life, it also happened in the history of at least the West, where around the 16th, perhaps, century, a change happened that resulted in the privileging of the mathematical sciences over philosophy. So, in many ways, and the reason why this is important, and I keep stressing it, is that what most people call common sense is neither common nor does it make sense if held up to scrutiny. It's not common because these are usually opinions. If you take someone and ask them to list all the things that they consider common sense, you'll see that they do not go back more than around 500 years. And something happened then to create the modern world, which ended in the privileging of the sciences. So, and Leo Strauss is someone who at least took great notice in that. So, how can we deepen this, please?
Yeah, now, certainly, but one thing I do want to emphasize is one of the greatest criticisms of Strauss and a number of the things that I've already said here with you is that it's somehow an elitist sort of view, or it's we're reading more into things than is there. And I want to emphasize that that's not what's going on. What's going on is that we have to be humble enough in our own recognition of ignorance to realize that uh, that again, these are the greatest thinkers that the Western world has ever known. And so we have to learn how to read very slowly. One of the things that I like to tell my students is that what we need to do is we need to learn how to look at less and see more.
Mm.
Very often, you'll have professors in philosophy courses with readings lists that are books and books, like you'll have 6, 7, 8 books. One of the greatest benefits in my education was that I went to a school where entire courses were built on just one text. We would take an entire course on just Plato's Republic, an entire course on just Plato's Laws, an entire course on just Aristotle's Ethics.
And this is very important because nowadays, from what I understand, universities don't do that. I have friends who teach at universities and they keep mentioning the ridiculously long titles of their courses. It's always something like Theory of Justice and the Rights of Man in the 21st Century Post. It's never Plato's Republic. It's never,
Yeah.
you know, Don Quixote or something. And Leo Strauss, the philosopher, had this idea, and he said that very clearly. He said, life is too short to read any book. You need to only read the great books, which, of course, nowadays sounds very elitist, like you said. But on the other hand, we live in an age that is trying to pretend to be egalitarian in the extreme. So it rejects any notion of hierarchy, any notion of better over worse.
And the unfortunate irony about all of that is that with almost zero exceptions, those arguments are founded on this idea of progress. They believe, and Kant says this explicitly, and Heidegger says this explicitly in some of their most important published works, is that they say we now know better than Plato. We now know them better than we understand them now better than they understood themselves.
I think it was Kant who said that. Yes.
Yes, Kant says it in the Critique of Pure Reason, and Heidegger says it in his Sophist commentary. Um, it's and it's very sad because see, when people take that approach to things, they are failing to recognize the original origins of what we have all become the heirs of, which again I want to emphasize for your audience in particular is Greece. We're talking about classical Athens. We There's no possible way that we can understand ourselves if we don't first begin with understanding the origin of of the very preconditions for ourselves. Things like democracy, things like philosophy, these all come from an original understanding of classical Athens.
Yes, and just to take you, so as not to open up too many tangents, on this turn, on this cultural turn that happened around the 16th century, whereby, let's say the scientist conquered over the philosopher, and perhaps the words of Rene Descartes are very important, the works of Bacon are very important, but um, something happened that resulted in, the average person on the street, so to speak, believing that even they know more than Plato because they know Darwin's evolution, they know a little bit about Freud's psychoanalysis, they know the sun rotates around, the earth rotates around the sun rather than the other way around. So today, even the absolutely, even the uneducated feels they can almost look down to Plato, and even if you quote something, you can often hear like, "What do they know? They lived 200,000, 2,500 years ago." Something happened in our history to enable that.
Right. So what I would point to is the phrase that I like to use to describe it is that what you're speaking of is the democratization of science. Um, with what happened with Descartes, with his methodological approach, right? What we call the scientific method. Uh, he's very explicit that everyone needs to approach knowledge that way, science that way. So science, the understanding of what science is, becomes radically expanded. And what we have is sort of the conflation between technology and science. So technology is just the application of science. Science itself is the knowledge learned from things, right? The knowledge that we actually know of things. And so when you claim to have a very specific method that will work to solve any problem, which we're taught is the scientific method, people take that and they apply it in realms that it doesn't necessarily belong to. Uh, so, for instance, neither Plato nor Aristotle would ever have agreed that you can approach political problems with a scientific method, right? Because uh, the the very nature of the problems that you're dealing with, which is ultimately an understanding of the human soul, that does not lend itself to the kind of analysis that Descartes was using, say, for instance, with his analytic geometry. So what we have, unfortunately, I mean, you simply can't dispute the ability of technology with the scientific method. I mean, it has given us profound insight into all sorts of things. But again, that doesn't mean that it is profound insight into everything, and most especially the political things, because a number of the greatest monstrosities that have taken place in human history since since modern science have been the attempt to apply science to politics. You look at the genocidal regimes of the 20th century, and almost without question, they all have attempted to do what they did in the name of science.
But was it, yeah, but was it really, I mean, to play devil's advocate here, was it really science that caused this tyranny, or was it just the tool for that tyranny to be even more cruel?
No, you're exactly right, because it certainly is not science. It was the tool. It was the tool that was sort of used in places it didn't really belong.
But do you see, so for example, if you take the Soviet Union, and obviously we can take Hitler's Germany as well, but do you see in these regimes the inappropriate application of science?
I mean, I certainly think it's indisputable that you do see an inappropriate application of science, but uh, again, this is this would be me sort of branching out into a kind of area that.
I haven't thought about it this way myself.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly, I don't know the details enough of the actual history going on there, but I would say that certainly that they did apply. I mean, all you have to do is look at Marx's writings. If you consider Karl Marx a philosopher, which most people do, he's very clear that, and see, this actually begins with Locke, John Locke too. He says that a method of ethics, or an actual understanding of ethics, can be discovered that literally has geometric precision. I mean, he said, I mean, and of course, he never provided that, though. He said he was going to, but he never provided it.
Yeah, like a calculus of ethics. And I mean, it's very interesting because I meet people who believe this today, and in all the confusion, I meet people that are very willing to run towards replacing perhaps even elected governments with some technocracy. I mean, I just had, there's someone in our team, for example, who believes that, and I'm obviously trying to convince him otherwise. But we had this, and I had this comeback when we had this discussion. I said, look, that's what the Soviet Union tried to do, to create a government of technocrats. And he said, no, because they were not scientists, they were ideologues. And I said, look, in their days, they believed they were scientists. And of course, he said, no, they were not scientists. They believed they were scientists, but they were ideologues. And of course, that leaves the question open. How can we be sure that we haven't slipped a lot of ideology in what we call science?
Well, this is where I would, again, I just I hate to sound like a broken record, but I just think that there's so much wisdom in Plato that most people are unaware of. One of the greatest teachings of both Plato and Aristotle is that there is a very, very powerful element of the irrational within the realm of politics. And it's not simply that it's just irrational, but that it cannot be eradicated. Uh,
It cannot be rationalized.
exactly, it cannot be rationalized. And Plato's Socrates and Plato's Athenian Stranger. In both of his two longest dialogues, I like to tell people if size really matters, then look at his longest dialogues. And in both of those dialogues, the primary characters, Socrates and the Athenian Stranger, they both explicitly say you cannot enlighten the many. The
Mm-hmm.
most that you can do is aim for a kind of moderate prudence. And this is where Aristotle comes in, because he really takes that ball and runs with it.
Yeah, and this is something that I keep telling people, and they don't believe me, that the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment, which is, I guess, the, current over which all modern nations of Europe have been built, have been floating into this current. And from where I'm sitting, Greece, because we had this uh, terrible event in our history of being 400 years subjugated to the Ottoman Empire, and we lost this enlightenment. And when we woke up from this historical coma, we felt that we had lost the biggest moment in Europe, and we now have to just rush and fill in the gaps. And we've been running ever since politically. So the Enlightenment is just like the word itself. It's up there. Is an indisputable, is considered by the modern mind as an indisputably good historical event.
Yeah.
Yet it would be the most ridiculous idea for the ancient philosophers because exactly they knew that not you cannot build a political system on the premise that every single individual within it will act rationally and will be convinced by argument.
And here's the thing, though. You're exactly right. They would have seen it as ridiculous, and in fact, they did. But they understood its allure. One of the best commentaries that I've ever read on Plato's Symposium is by a friend of mine, Stephen Berg, and the title of his commentary on Plato's Symposium is called "Intoxicated Enlightenment."
Wow.
Yeah, because when you look at the symposium, what you have is a very small gathering of the most intelligent and the best individuals that classical Athens had to offer. You have Socrates, you have Alcibiades, you have Aristophanes.
And you had for listeners, you had a variety as well. So it wasn't, and we're talking about Plato's famous work, the Symposium, one of his most beautiful works. I read it very young, and it influenced me a lot. And you have this gathering, like you said, and it wasn't a tech conference or a gathering of scientists. You had a bit of everything. You had Socrates, famously the man who knew that he knew nothing. You had Aristophanes, the great comedy writer. So you had a comedian, and you had Agathon, who was a poet, who was an actual historical figure. And Aristotle mentions Agathon, and in the Symposium, he is presented as this very young, seductive, just like the ancient Greeks thought the absolute of beauty was, young, intelligent, noble, poetic, and and you have also a doctor.
Yes,
And
Eric Zimicus.
Yeah, a doctor and a let's what would be the equivalent today, like a law politician perhaps. And what I found fascinating, they're talking about love, eros, and as it happens in many Plato's dialogues, you will find your opinion somewhere. It's a bunch of people talking, and inevitably you will find yourself in one of these characters, and one of them will say, he'll voice his opinion on the subject and say, yes, this is, and usually it's not Socrates. Usually Socrates will kind of, and it was very interesting for me to talking about science in the symposium. How Eryximachos, I think is his name. If you just mentioned it, um, so they're discussing love, eros. What is it? They're trying to find out, and obviously Socrates has the last word, but Eryximachos has this explanation which is very, very modern. Essentially, he says that love is a chemical imbalance in the brain. He doesn't use the word hormones, but he uses the word hymos, which is fluids that the ancient Greeks and actually the whole world until very recently believed in the theory of humus, of that our body is regulated by 5 or 6 fluids, from where we have these words. We say melancholic, which is black, melancholy, black juice. We say someone is melancholic, and the ancient Greeks would say he's got an excess of this black bile, or he's phlegmatic, he has an excess of phlegm. And Eryximachos essentially explains love as an imbalance of these juices, which is almost like he's writing in the 21st century.
And you're exactly right. And I would actually go further because and this was only brought to my attention through Stephen Berg's commentary, but Strauss also addresses it in his own commentary on the symposium. What you have with Eryximachus is he's a doctor. What he does is he provides the sort of technological expert's opinion on on how Eros itself is an overall encompassing uh, description of the entire cosmos. So he takes his knowledge of sort of the doctor's knowledge, and he casts it so broadly that he believes that he can account for every single thing in the universe uh, with his sort of medical training. And I think that that more than anything sort of gets to the core of the kind of experts, the tyrannical experts that we're living under today.
Yeah, and just to focus on this, let's make it into like a theater play. Okay, so so again, we're back in ancient Athens. We're sitting somewhere in the symposium as audience, and we hear Eryximachos explaining love, explaining eros as a chemical imbalance in the brain with surprisingly modern terms, and the modern reader will say, "There it is. He pinned it. He nailed it." And then you have Socrates who says, "No, no, no, no. This cannot be so." But he offers an account for eros that for modern man it's far too mythical, even mystical. And his account, just very briefly, because it's very beautiful, Socrates says that, first of all, he says that his opinion is not his opinion. It has been revealed to him through a
Yeah.
priestess of Apollo.
Right.
So already it's like he lost most modern readers. It's
Yeah.
like, we're done. It's a chemical imbalance. Why discuss it further? And he says, so it has been revealed to me through divine source that Eros was born, the people can imagine Cupid in Latin, the winged god. He was born in a banquet of the gods when Aphrodite, goddess of sexual desire, was born. The gods threw a banquet to celebrate, and there was Plutos invited, the god of wealth, who is obviously representing wealth, abundance, is very beautiful and very abundant. And also Penia, poverty, the goddess of poverty, who's like a minor deity in the ancient pantheon. We can understand why she was not celebrated very much. But so she goes there, and obviously Pluto's wealth is very abundant, larger than life. He drinks a lot, he eats a lot, and he drinks too much and he falls into a stupor. And Penia, poverty, sees him, and she lies with him, and as he's passed out, it's very again very modern, and and she gets pregnant, and Eros is the product. That is Socrates' account. Eros is the child of poverty and wealth, and through his mother, Eros is presented by Socrates in contrast with the imaginary, as ugly, as old, as kind of in need, in constant need. And from his father's side, he took the instinct of beauty and of good things. So Eros is that in-between creature. So we have the medical opinion, which resounds much better with a modern mind, and we have Socrates' opinion. How can we, how can we support Socrates' opinion in the 21st century?
Well, also too, the funny thing about Eros, as Socrates describes it, is that it's a perfect description of Socrates himself. I mean, he actually says Eros is, the poor aspect of Eros is such that Eros walks around without sandals, which of course everyone knows is Socrates, because he's never wearing sandals, even when it's freezing cold
Yeah.
and he's on a
So
military.
he's a cameo appearance in his own myth.
Yeah,
But how can we defend it?
yeah. I think the easiest way to understand it is if if thoughtful people simply look into themselves and say, why is it that I have this desire to know things, then they will assuredly find much more of Socrates' Eros in themselves than they will of Eryximachus's Eros, because when we sit back and we are just honest with ourselves and say, why is it that I enjoy listening to this podcast about philosophy, or why am I drawn to want to listen to these sorts of things? We don't honestly think to ourselves it's because we have a chemical imbalance in our brain. We think to ourselves that it's because there's something about the nature of our soul that desires to know these things, and that we also don't know them, and it's precisely because we don't know them that we want to know them. And that's really what Socrates is getting at. And so I would simply say, to your listeners, that that's probably the best way to approach it, is to just look at yourself. I mean, this is what Socrates is always talking about, self knowledge for, is because uh, we don't we normally do not have to go outside of ourselves to find the treasures that we're seeking, because the treasures that we're seeking usually are already within us. We just have to understand and recognize that that's where they're at. And that's essentially what Socrates is saying. I mean, you have to, that's why for Socrates, philosophy ultimately is a deep concern with friendships, because we find in other people those things that we're so looking for within ourselves, and they help us find those as well.
Mm-mm. And I guess looking into ourselves, I think unfortunately today comes with a lot of baggage, because it seems lately we're going through like a second wave hippie movement, where a lot of the 60s are being played back, honestly. And on the self knowledge, I'll put it in quotes aspect, there's a lot of Eastern mysticism that has slipped inside. Your average Facebook post today is, five ways to discover a narcissist and how to get over your ego. And this, I mean, it's very funny to me, because I'm someone who believes that metaphysics is everything. Ultimately, everything boils down to the question of being. What is to be? And, something as simple as a Facebook post, if you look deeper, you'll find a lot of Eastern mysticism surrounding what is the ego, what is the self, what is the larger self, that is carried through. So it's interesting to note that when we say self knowledge, we don't mean that. We don't assume much. We just mean observe the phenomenon as it happens, I guess. And please correct me if I'm wrong. Um, I guess what you're saying is that if you observe the phenomenon of eros, of loving, of falling in love, you will find that it is somewhere between having and not having. The phenomenon as it arises is a child of poverty and wealth.
Yeah, you're exactly right, and I'm so glad that you even brought that term up, phenomenon, because that's ultimately what we're dealing with when we're dealing with Socrates, is that he is he is a kind of phenomenologist. For those in your audience who have any familiarity with contemporary philosophy, it's just that for Socrates, the phenomenon that he's looking towards uh, are political things, right? Cicero famously says that Socrates pulled philosophy down from the heavens and forced it to live with men and talk about things like good and evil and such, as opposed to the physicists, the natural philosophers. But yes, that's exactly what it is. I mean, there's no need for. I'm not dismissing Eastern philosophy. I mean,
No, absolutely.
but what I'm saying is that we already have enough in the West, precisely because of Plato and Aristotle, uh, to describe these sorts of things without bringing in Eastern mysticism. I mean, because everything in Plato and Aristotle already accounts for these sorts of things. I mean, if you look at how they discuss things like nous, right? The
Mm,
kind of the flashes of intellectual apprehension that we have on occasion that we can't describe. That's not Eastern mysticism. That's simply being honest about the phenomenon as we live them. And these are the things that Plato and Aristotle are constantly writing about.
yes, and at least you have to know you have to have your own house in order. I believe,
Yes, yes,
because we are, whether we like it or not, and understand we're living through a time where it's not very cool, unfortunately, to self-identify, to identify with your nation, to identify, with your people, with your culture, with your race. It's not very cool, but we are Western men, and this is the only way to be human, is to be something specific.
right.
A human is not this Vitruvian archetype of a human. I am human, you are human. We're all specific instances. And as Western men, we have to have our house in order and know what ideas have formed us so that we don't project them on foreign ideas. Because I feel that a lot of
Yes,
people who just rush into Eastern mysticism, they carry all the baggage of Western philosophy without even having clarified it.
yes, that's exactly right, and that's another reason why, in my own life, I just get so frustrated when I look around myself and I see uh, so many people who it simply seems to be just fashionable to try to dump everything about our Western heritage and rush to embrace something that's non-Western simply because it's non-Western. And what they fail to understand is that you can't dump something if you don't fully understand what it even is. Uh,
Exactly.
and sadly, that's where things stand uh, with classical philosophy. Is it's not fashionable to be an expert in classical philosophy now, because so many people think that, well, hey, that's over 2,000 years ago. I mean, there's a lot that has happened since then. And I simply like to say, well, true, but despite the fact that a lot has happened since then and a lot has been learned since then, does that necessarily mean that we ever understood them in the first place?
Yes, and this is something that Strauss brings out. So, just back, flashing back to your life, in your life, what was the state of classical learning when you made that Socratic uh, turn in your life?
Yeah, even I mean, this has been going on for a long time now. The sort of the turn against all things old, and it's because, particularly once we get to Kant and Hegel, there's this belief in progress and history. But in the department that I started at, um, it was literally ground zero in America for the climate change movement. They really were the ones who kicked it off, and they have just about the most outstanding department in the country, uh,
For climate change.
advocating things like climate change. And all of that, people need to understand all of that is deeply, deeply bound up with postmodernism. And this comes to us from Heidegger's essay, The Question Concerning Technology. And so that department was deeply, deeply postmodern. And yet, in that department, there was one particular professor who is easily one of the greatest living scholars of Strauss, and he went against the grain. And I was fortunate enough to just stumble on one of his classes one day, and immediately during his first lecture, I recognized I was in the presence of someone who was brilliant, and I just wanted to learn from him. And of course, he, as a side note, which is something I think that cannot be emphasized enough, he was brutal to our essays. He destroyed our essays all the way down to our grammar. I mean, things that I didn't even know existed in grammar, he graded me on. And that angered so many students, and they hated him for that. They already did not like him because he was not a postmodernist. But they hated the fact that he was very, very demanding upon us. And what they failed to realize is that, and see, this is well, there's a couple famous Greek proverbs that come up in the Platonic dialogues, right? Kalipita kala, right? The noble, the beautiful things are difficult. The noble things are difficult. And Pathimathos, right? Learning through suffering, right? That's sort of the harbinger of tragedy. Um, you know, these things are these things are not going to come to us very easily. We have to be very modest with ourselves and say, I'm not going to be necessarily good at something right off the bat. Nobody is, and that applies to everything in life.
And after all, if you're in a university, you're in a training ground. It's not just like some random person who trashed your essay. That's what you're there for, and you're paying money for that.
Right, and that's one of the things that he taught us more than anything is he said if the university has anything to teach its students, it's the essay. Because if you can write a good essay, that means that you can think clearly, that you can organize your thoughts, and you can articulate them well. And my fear is that we are living in a generation now where all of that is dying almost overnight.
Yeah, that is very tragic and very interesting. Just to take the thread from the beginning, you talked about postmodernism, and I'm sure that most people listening know the word, maybe they don't know the meaning, but just to go back in a flash in my biography, when I finished school, I guess late 90s, um, as a very young man, I wanted the latest, the cutting edge. So when I started to be interested in philosophy, I wanted the cutting edge. And the cutting edge in the 90s in philosophy was postmodernism. So I picked up a book, random, I think it was Baudrillard's System of Objects, perhaps was the first postmodern, and I felt my IQ dropping by 20 points, and which I did not feel when I read Plato,
Right.
which is very interesting. And I read it and I reread it and I reread it and I got something out of it. But I struggled with postmodernism, and it is with something that I just need to understand. Okay, these texts that came mainly from French intellectuals during the 70s and 80s, and they became very popular in the 80s and 90s. These French texts that we call postmodernism, that somehow managed to conquer the world, they are some of the most boring, dry, incomprehensible, and pretentious texts out there. How did this philosophy manage to conquer and influence the world when I am striving in my own show to clarify? I'm sure you, as an educator, you're striving to clarify difficult meanings. Yet postmodernism took easy, common, banal meanings and made it more difficult. How did it succeed?
Yeah. Okay. So this is actually a very crucial topic, and one that I want to make a special qualification about. Um, Leo Strauss was I mean, in a sense, we are all postmodernists because this is simply the world we live in, and we are influenced by a number of postmodern ideas. Now, what I like to tell people is I say, look, um, I believe that postmodernism has earned a seat at the table to be heard. The question, though, is this. Uh, when you were talking about the phenomenon of human existence, you have to ask yourself, you say, okay, there are a number of people sitting at the table who have earned a right to be there, and they're telling us how they believe it can be best accounted for. And my position on it is this: postmodernism, which is it's not a single school of thought. There are a number of different. It's like existentialism. There are a number of different thinkers sort of encompassed in it.
It's a description rather than a school. It's a tendency. It's a tendency rather than. It's like saying Gnosticism. It's a tendency.
Right. And so what I say is, I say they have a case to make, but the question that we all have to ask ourselves is, we say, okay, is the case that they provide for the phenomenon of human existence, is that as persuasive as what we might find, say, in Plato? And my personal reading of all of this is that no, I think Plato has a much better account of the human being. Now, as far as how postmodernism has overtaken essentially the intellectual life of the West, most of that comes from Heidegger. Nietzsche sort of started it. Heidegger picked up the ball from where Nietzsche sort of left it. And Heidegger is a profoundly deep thinker, very, very deep thinker. The problem with Heidegger, though, is that he was taken up by a number of thinkers in France, and my my opinion about this is that those thinkers in France were not up to the level of thought that Heidegger was, and they appropriated Heidegger's thought, and they critiqued him, and then they offered alternatives. And it's like everything else. It just sort of became fashionable after that because it was the thing that everyone was talking about.
Yeah, and something that I like to get out. There are thinkers. This is something to think about. There are thinkers that are so profound that even if you misquote them, you will sound profound.
Yeah, yeah,
And I will, especially in postmodernity, and I'm just going to give an example. You can tell me what you think, that because these thinkers like Heidegger are so difficult to get into, and because so few people take, and especially Heidegger, one of the reasons that he's not better known is unfortunately that he was on the wrong side of history, and he was affiliated at some point with the Nazi Party in Germany, and that was his black page in his private life. And it goes to show how much of an important thinker he was, that people still thought he was worth taking up. But, he's definitely far less known than he would have been otherwise. And you have someone like Judith Butler, for instance, who said, there's no such thing as man or woman. There's no such thing, because she says, man is performative. Okay, you are a man as long as you perform, you act as a man. It's not an essence that you have. Is like a process. And someone could reply and go very vulgar and say, "What if I take off my pants and show you my genitals?" And she might say that's also a performance. You're at the point where So there's no such thing as man, because it's just an action. Man is an action. And a lot of people are taken aback. And I know people that was, wow, but what she fails to acknowledge is that in that school of thought, everything is performative. Everything is a process, is that phenomenological way of thinking. I'm standing next to a table, and you can also say that a table is a process. It tables. you know, a table, tables, water, waters, a man, mans. Everything is performative if seen as a process. And you can go down to the microphysics and see everything, or Heraclitus, everything is a stream of energy. But in philosophy, the philosophy of Martin Heidegger, everything is a being. It's a process. But she somehow takes a partial view of that, a partial application to prove her own point. And she makes it sound profound just because she's partially quoting someone great. Even if you partially quote someone like Heidegger, you can pretend you're great.
Yeah, and you know, when we sort of get into the weeds like this about sort of very difficult things that perhaps a number of people in the audience might not even know, I like to think about this, or I like to put it this way. So just last week, I think, or the week before, there is a huge controversy going on in Brazil because they at a museum of art, they have installed a 30-foot concrete vagina. And they are upset that people on the right don't want it considered as art. And they'll make all kinds of arguments, attempts at philosophical arguments of why it should be art. And I take that example and I say, look, I say this is why I like studying Plato and Aristotle. Because with both Plato and Aristotle, the fundamental question, sort of literally the definitive Socratic question, was always this: what's the good life? What is the good life? And when you ask yourself and you focus your attention on that question, you end up not dealing with these sorts of things that just they sort of just make you shake your head and say, why are people even talking about those other, like, why are we even having a discussion about a 30-foot concrete vagina? There are much more pressing issues in life, especially right now with COVID and everything. Why can't we just address this question, what's the good life? Because I can assure you that any answer to the question of what is the good life would involve people having to address these ridiculous lockdowns, and they would not be tied up in discussions about 30-foot concrete vaginas.
Yeah, absolutely. And just before we get to that, back in your university days, and I read some of David Hansen's books. There's a great book about the Greek phalanx called the Western Way of War, and he wrote about the what he saw as the destruction of the classics in academia, which is something that unfortunately many people are not aware. I mean, if you don't believe me, you can just Google Homer censored
Yeah,
or something,
yeah.
because Homer's Odyssey apparently has recently been considered sexist. You saw this transition back in your student days, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, this has been going on since about the 60s, like what you pointed out. The professors that were originally behind a whole lot of this, uh, they also participated in legitimate acts of domestic terrorism during the 60s. And rather than being thrown in jail like they deserved to be, they were granted tenureship as professors at various universities in America, and very prestigious universities in America.
So radical leftist terrorists, you're saying, became part of the establishment in education.
Yes, they legitimately attempted to bomb various federal buildings, the United States Capitol, things like this, and they actually uh, they got away with it. They were granted tenureship as professors. Barack Obama was very close friends with one of the most notorious of them, a man by the name of Bill Ayers. And these people have spent the last 40, 50 years teaching generations of students to essentially indoctrinating them into these radical ideologies, and it has gone under the radar because parents pay for their students to go to the university, and they never ask the students, they never ask their kids. They say, well, what are you learning in school? What do you enjoy so much? And so all they care about is if they're making good grades and if they got into a good school. And so what has happened is that these parents in America for generations now have believed that they have trusted universities with the care and the education of their children, uh, because they didn't think that those people would ever do such a thing to their children. And see, this is what I point back to classical philosophy, and I say, I say there was a time when people were charged with corruption of the youth, and it was a capital offense. They were killed. What people fail to understand is that that was the charge that Athens put Socrates to death for. The charge was explicitly corruption of the youth. They were so afraid that their children were going to lose their attachment to the traditional values, the things that they held sacred, that they would put people to death for attempting to even do that. And now we've seen this reversal in America, at least. I suspect in the rest of the world as well, certainly the West, where people are actually praised for corrupting the youth.
The youth. But what if they say, just to hear both sides of the argument, that they actually identify with Socrates, that they're doing, if Socrates corrupted the youth, then maybe your average professor now is doing Socrates' work.
Yeah, well, in that case, I would simply point them toward the actual dialogues and say, you show me any place where Socrates teaches imprudence, right? See, prudence is the key. If you understand the philosophical virtue of prudence, then you would never ever uh, engage in the kind of activities that we are seeing on a mass scale in America right now. See, that's the key to understanding classical political philosophy, is to see that their teachings are always in the spirit of a very cautious uh, prudence within political community, because they understand that not only must philosophy be protected from the city, but they fully understood that the city itself must also be protected from philosophy, and that's what people fail to understand.
Yes, and today, unfortunately, where tradition has been so demoted, people look to academics, to scientists, like we said before, for moral guidance, and they dismiss, they demote, especially religion and tradition, which is included in religion, and they dismiss it as any kind of, and they fail, I think, to realize that. This has happened before. And although I guess the great political philosophers could have not imagined our world and did not know our, proverbial divide between the left and the right, someone like Plato or Aristotle did not know that. But I feel that somehow they could have predicted how the world ended up. Somehow.
Yeah, that's, we hear a lot of that in America because that's what they talk about regarding our Constitution. They say that our founders could never have predicted this or could never have predicted that. And again, I just point to reading the original sources. I say, okay, if you are so convinced that they did not foresee that certain circumstances like these would arise, then point me to specific indications in the text where you think that they have been proven wrong. Because I can point you to a number of very, very specific points in the text that indicate that they fully understood just how bad things could get. They fully understood everything involved in technology. They, we, there's a saying. I, I don't remember its exact source. I think the exact source is still being contested. It's certainly attributed to Newton. But he says, if I've seen further, it's because I stand on the shoulders of giants.
Yes, it has been attributed.
Yeah, so we are standing on the shoulders of giants, and we find ourselves in this very regrettable situation where we're literally on their shoulders and we're making fun of them, saying they're not giants.
Yes, that's a very good image. That's a very good image. But just to go back to that moment in the 60s, there is this notion, the long march through the institutions, which essentially, uh, I'm gonna give it the benefit of the doubt, just as a host. Let's call it a theory, and the theory goes that um, as as the left wing was losing the actual fight, it was losing support because it has been discredited through the Soviet Union. Living standards have been raising steadily throughout the 20th century, which meant that the working classes were not in that desperate situation that they were perhaps 100 years ago. So the left was losing ground constantly, and it changed into this culture form. And instead of the guerrilla warfare, they changed into the academic warfare, and they took over the institution of education. And that is more or less what people call the long march through the institutions. Some people claim this is a conspiracy theory, but you actually saw it, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I could point you to a number of examples in my own life, but what I would say is it's demonstrably not a conspiracy theory, at least not in America, because our our first president, who was very much an academic, um, was a uh, was a very devoted student to Hegel, um, Woodrow Wilson, and he actually wrote entire books. I mean, all you have to do is read them; they're there. He wrote entire books where he specifically says that we need to install within academia uh, people who have studied Hegel and that will advocate Hegel. And he says this specifically because he says if you can get the law schools full of professors who teach Hegel, then what you have effectively done is you've ensured that our future politicians and our future judges will also be Hegelians. And
And what does this, Hegelianism mean in this context?
in this context, what it means is a firm belief in the administrative state, which Hegel argues for in his philosophy of right. He's essentially the one that gives us the notion of a bureaucrat, uh, elected officials for life who will live on the dime.
So the deep state in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, that's sort of a frowned upon phrase because they say that in itself is a conspiracy theory. Uh, but yes, the deep state administrative state is really what it is, where everything is administered from the top down. Um,
Mhm. And Hegel saw this as a completion of history. He saw this as the apex of Western history.
yeah, he understood it as the what we could think of as the rule of reason in government, right? And if you can have the rule of reason, then all will be fine. One of the most frightening phrases that Hegel uses throughout the philosophy of right is he says that there will no longer be heroes. And the reason he says that there will no longer be heroes is because everyone will be reasonable, and so in a sense, everyone will already be a hero. Um, Now, I would say that that's a very dangerous thought because first of all, it's simply not going to happen. and openly saying that there's not going to be any heroes is a radical dismissal of what we
And
would
it's
call.
again this notion that we know better than everyone else in history, and although every other culture celebrated heroes, we are different and better. And somehow I think Hegel saw the state as the embodiment of reason.
Yeah, it certainly was. Yeah, I mean, he explicitly does argue that the state is the culmination, the rational state is the culmination of the entire history of mankind.
So the more bureaucratic a state becomes, the more rational, hence the more progressive, hence better.
Right, and also particularly in America, so you have to understand what Wilson and a number of the progressives were fighting against was the belief that the Constitution. They were fighting against the belief that the Constitution should not be changed. They wanted to see the Constitution changed, and the primary reason for that was because,
Into what?
well, they believe it needed to be constantly updated to match the times. Right, because again, the whole point is that there's this sort of long march of history itself, and the Constitution needed to be adjusted. And you also have to keep in mind, Hegel was vehemently against the notion of natural rights. He did not believe in natural rights, and he also did not believe in any kind of social contract theories. Uh, for a whole host of reasons. And in America, that's what our Constitution is literally
Is based upon. So you kind of gave me the answer that I was looking for, because again, I mentioned postmodern writings, how difficult they were, and how surprised I was to see them becoming so popular. And then you mentioned how during the 60s, a lot of radicals took over the by force, and they were allowed to. And the question is why it feels like the ground was prepared long before they did that. And it seems that it goes back deeper than the 60s, because a lot of people, especially modern conservatives, they blame the 60s. I've blamed the 60s for a lot of the, you know, deregulation of society. But I always suspected, and you kind of confirm that it goes way before, into the very, would it be fair to say, the philosophical foundations of America?
well, yes, certainly, certainly at least in the early 20th
It's
century.
almost like they set a philosophical time bomb there.
Right, and see,
They would explode. Yeah.
yeah. To be fair, it wasn't just Hegel. It was also John Dewey in America. Uh, Now, John Dewey was a very, very outspoken advocate of Hegel, but Dewey himself took Hegel into different directions. But yes, this is the early 20th century, and they were always writing about how to reform education. And see, this is again, now this speaks also to one of the reasons why I chose my pseudonym as the Athenian Stranger, is because when most people think of Plato, they think of the philosopher king, right, from the Republic. Uh, it turns out that, see, that's Plato's second longest dialogue. If you go to his longest dialogue, which is Plato's Laws, the philosopher king is explicitly replaced by the supervisor of the education. So it turns out that Plato's final word on who should rule or who should be granted the most power is the person that's in charge of the education of the youth. Because
That's the key.
yes, once you control the education, you officially control the entire regime. And that's and see the important thing to keep in mind about that is that uh, the obverse of that is that if you lose education, then you lose the regime. And unfortunately, that's where many countries, certainly the most powerful countries in the Western world, are sort of imploding right now, is because they have lost control of the education. They've essentially handed it over to the youth, who are very, very imprudent, and they like to think that they know things that they don't fully understand. And that's why you see Nietzsche was certainly correct when he said the greatest revolutions in the history of mankind occur almost in silence, because that's essentially what has happened now. This all of these things with COVID and Black Lives Matters, these did not happen in the last 11 months. The road to where
or 11 years even.
Exactly, or 11 years, the road to where we are at right now has been paved by easily, very easily, over 100 years of very meticulous work by activists in the realm of education. And so when people say, I can't believe this happened so quickly, and I'm guilty of this too, because I look at this and I say, how did this happen? But the fact is, we should know, and many of us do know, that it didn't just happen just now. This has been a long time in the making, and it's finally sort of surfaced entirely. Uh,
Yes, and I know that you suffered from that because one of the reasons that you have your pseudonym, the Athenian Stranger, was that you were was it doxed the correct term or
yeah, I'm still dealing with that daily. There are a number of other people who continue to try to dox me because they simply want to discredit me for any number of reasons. I mean, uh, just like any other human being, I'm still a human being, and so of course there are certain things about my life that uh, you know have happened that some people would say, well, okay, that happened to you, you did that or something, so you're not worth listening to. Uh,
and just to segue there, you were because I'd like to finish your biography as well. So you went on to become an academic yourself. You went on to teach in a university.
yes. So I'm a much better researcher than I am an educator. I prefer to stay, my relationship to academia, I prefer to keep simply at the level of research. Um, it's not very, even if you were to teach undergraduates at one of the most prestigious universities, either in America or the world, it doesn't always end up being very fun because again, at the end of the day, you have to realize you're still dealing with kids who are barely out of high school.
Mm.
So there's always that aspect of it. Um, Whether or not I actually pursue further into the realm of academia, that I don't know anymore.
But what? Yeah, and once you went to do your research, it's when things hit the fan, and that's when you were attacked for taking a position on COVID.
Yeah, no, I mean this is the attacks upon me are only very recent, and that's because it was just with the COVID stuff. Because there were, I noticed a bunch of my former students, many of my former best students, they were doing that virtue signal thing where they were saying that essentially if you're not walking around wearing a mask, you're a morally bad person. And so all I was trying to do was bring legitimate research to bear on the problem. I was simply posting research by real experts on the subject.
That's what you do. You're a researcher, so you were doing your job. So, and to bring everything together, I mean, we talked a little bit, about that change whereby the scientist conquered over the philosopher in the history of Europe. And now, as of late, it seems that this is coming to its final close, where we are moving into some kind of technocracy with COVID as the battling ram. And I'm not even going to get into the whole medical, I'm not a doctor. I can quote some of the research I read, but this gets ugly very quickly. Obviously, not between us because we mostly agree, but in general. So I'm not going to pretend I'm even an adequate researcher in this. But however you see COVID, it is, I think, obvious that we are moving into a new state of things, into a new regime that is going to be the apex of what started so many centuries ago, whereby philosophy is going to be dead and the scientist is going to be dancing over the body. Just a grim image.
Yeah, I think that's exactly correct, and this is what I like to tell people is that regardless of your stance on the whole COVID issue, it's very, very difficult for for anyone to remain intellectually honest with themselves when they look at the policies that are being implemented to combat uh, the virus and say that they're not frightening. Um, it's I've heard all sides of the issue. I've heard people saying, yes, well, people want their freedom, but what good is freedom if you're dead from the virus? And so and there are a number of my good friends who make this case, and I listen to that, and I can in many ways sympathize and understand where they're coming from, but I think that what a lot of people fail to understand is that in the realm of politics, once a policy is implemented, it sets a precedence, and it is almost never taken back. It's I don't even know of any cases in Western history where very strong measures were taken uh, that, in a sense, transcended the law that were not eventually taken back. I mean, we certainly do have instances in America where things that were once monstrously legal have now become illegal. Uh, but the ability of the government to use the power to do these things, that has not changed. And that's what I fear is happening throughout the Western world, is that it doesn't take a genius to realize that politicians don't always have our best interests at heart, and they simply like to have more power. And so, if they have a reason that they can try to hide behind to justify their overreach of power, they are almost always going to use it.
Many people come back and say, well, if you're dead, none of that matters. None of your philosophy matters if you're dead. Well, we have to remember that throughout the Greek writings, there was this understanding that you have to choose at some point between the good life. You mentioned the good life. What is a good life? And whether you're going to promote security over freedom. Because what people forget, and it was very clear throughout the works of the Greek philosophers, that freedom and safety, although both very desirable, are contradictory.
Yeah.
The more free you are, the less safe you are. You can think, people listening can think about how you raise a child. The more you let it roam free, the more dangers is going to be involved. And the more you keep it indoors, the more safe it's going to be, the less free it's going to be. You have to strike a balance, but to strike that balance, you need to understand the dynamics of these two things. And people somehow, for some reason, as of COVID, have it's almost like they answered, what is the good life? The safe life.
Yeah. Yeah, and that it's not just that it's frightening, but it's really saddening when you think about it, because again, here I would point back to classical Greece, and I would say look at what they gave us, right? When you look at just the architecture, the philosophy, the political philosophy, the painting, just the beauty itself that Greece at its best gave us, and then ask yourself, did they do the kinds of things to their people that we're seeing done right now? And that, maybe there are arguments on both sides to say, well, yes, they did in this respect, or no, they didn't. But I think it's certainly worth considering uh, and thinking about very deeply, because it's difficult for me to, because you see, Socrates was in his 70s when they finally put him to death, so he lived a very long life, being able to go around and heckle people and talk to them for decades and decades out in the open. And one wonders, what would a Socrates be doing during these times right now? And that's something I think that we should
Yes,
aspire towards.
and
Yeah, so and I want to return exactly segue from this question and just ask, put the question back to you because it seems that everything that's happening around us is so technologically based and we live in such modern times that again, many people will think that the ancient philosophers have nothing to teach us because they did not know the internet and the iPhone, you know. Um, what's the best comeback to that?
Well, in my experience, the people that say those kinds of things and make those kind of arguments, they haven't actually read uh, these people that they're criticizing, or if they have, they haven't read them very closely at all. Um, and again, I would just simply point and say, if you pick any thoughtful person out of a crowd and you ask them, you say, would you like to know what Plato thought? Or would you like to know what Aristotle thought? They would almost always say yes. Because there is a natural desire in most people, particularly thoughtful people, to just simply want to know. And so, if people are serious about wanting to know, then they'll do the reading. They'll look into the readings.
Yes, that's what I keep on saying. Just and that's how I got into it when I read the actual text because it is true that the way these philosophers are presented is heavily tinted, to say the least, by the dominant culture. And but somehow these texts, this is I guess a little segue, but somehow these texts have a power, um,
Oh,
and
absolutely, yeah,
that they can almost resonate with me. It it's a question that obviously we're not going to get to the bottom of this in this or perhaps the next 20 interviews. But there's a question of where is the meaning of a text. You read a text and where's the meaning? Is the meaning like light emitted from the sun? Is it radiated out of the text? Is it something that's triggered in the reader, whereby the text is like the key to a lock? Um, and obviously, like I said, is a very, but it feels that the texts themselves have a power to radiate some meaning without getting into hermeneutics very deeply, but just to counter this very postmodern idea that a text is uh, almost like a random assortment of words and you can make it anything you want out of it. I disagree experientially. When I read The Republic, when I read Symposium that I mentioned, it did something to me that was very real.
yeah. And you already mentioned this earlier. That's the beauty of the Platonic dialogues, and I would argue it's also to be found in Aristotle. A lot of people will say that Aristotle wrote treatises, but if you pay very close attention to any of his writings, you see that uh, he's actually not always speaking in his own voice. He's sort of uh, presenting different people's opinions, and you have to follow them through and say, okay, now, so what's actually being said here? Where does Aristotle himself stand on these things? And what you mentioned earlier nailed it. Is that when we read these writings, it's like any other just very good piece of literature, or like a movie that we would watch. We find ourselves in specific characters and we say, oh my gosh, I can see myself saying that. Or, oh my gosh, I recognize that person right there because I know a person like that, right? I know a Thrasymachus. I know someone who's going to say
yes,
say
Yes.
might makes right, and so that's sort of the allure of the beautiful, right? That's what draws us into things, and it makes us wrestle with the text. It makes us want to wrestle with the text and say, "Oh, I have to understand. There's something more being said here. I really need to figure this out." And that's why Heidegger himself was so astonishingly popular when he was lecturing, because Heidegger was able to take just single sentences of, either of a Platonic text or of an Aristotelian text or the pre-Socratics. He would take just single sentences and devote entire courses to these things.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and the students were just blown away by it because, see, when we're in the presence of true wisdom, it's undeniable. It reaches in and grabs a hold of us. Because again, there is that natural desire inside of us that wants to know things, and I think that tapping into that natural desire and bringing other people aware of it, that's how we can hopefully get out of these kinds of very bad situations like we're dealing with right now, whether it's COVID, whether it's Black Lives Matters. If we can get people to understand and recognize the eros in themselves of what it is that they're wanting to accomplish with their activism, or what it is that they're wanting to hide from in their fear, if we can get people to recognize these things, then that could be our salvation, and that is exactly what the best of classical philosophy has to offer for all of us.
Yes, and once you mentioned Heidegger, I'd like to mention a very beautiful little point he made in one of his lectures on the German poet Hölderlin, and one of his poems, as he was digging as he was just speaking, page after page in the text on a single verse of that poem,
Yeah.
he almost pauses and says, what are we doing here? He says, what, what would be the cost of misunderstanding Holderling? He asks. Apparently, the lecture hall. He says it's not like miscalculating the length of a steel beam in a suspension bridge, right? Or the torque of an internal combustion engine, where everything can blow up. It's, as we say, and I'm quoting him almost verbatim, is, as we say, no big deal, he says. And then he follows up and says, but perhaps one day in our history, something will come to pass, something that will have its roots in that misunderstanding of the single verse in Holderling. And perhaps that something are the lockdown measures on COVID.
Yeah, see, that right there is a perfect example of something that is simply undeniably beautiful. That wants to pull us into it. That we want to be pulled into that and say, okay, there is true wisdom that's being said there. I want to know more about it. And yes, that's exactly, you're exactly right with equating that with, for instance, the lockdown policies or the Black Lives Matters things. The consequences, and this is why, I think we were 5 months into the lockdowns when I was actually saying to people, I said, ignorance is no longer an excuse, because there is too much devastation that's happening around us to our fellow citizens, our fellow countrymen, our family, for us to bury our heads in the sand about this. And I think that that's a kind of uh, a moral responsibility that sort of we're talking about right now, is that we are at a time when we need to actively educate ourselves on these fundamental issues, because the consequences for us not trying to at least better understand what is going on, and what the best writers of the Western tradition have to teach us, the consequences of not doing that are the fact that we could very well lose our civilization. We are headed down that road very quickly.
Yes, it seems so. And education does not mean complication. And one thing you find in the Greek philosophers, and Leo Strauss obviously took note of that, and he said the ancient Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, could philosophize on the most important things without adding a single new word in their vocabulary.
Yes,
They could philosophize using the common language
yes,
and talk about anything from the beginning of the world to the essence of being. And today, anyone taking a course in university, the proverbial introduction to philosophy, introduction to sociology, psychology. Essentially, what they're taking is a course on a new vocabulary. Essentially, from like a semester course on sociology, you come up just knowing a new jargon. It takes a semester apparently just to get used to these new terms before you even get to the meat. But Socrates could philosophize without any jargon.
That honestly cannot be emphasized enough, because that is so absolutely crucial. Now, Aristotle himself did use a few sort of complicated terms. However, the way that he used those terms, if you understand the Greek language, was rather obvious. Um, Nietzsche was another one who was able to accomplish amazing things in philosophy without ever using complicated terms. And he's emphatic about that. He actually mocks people that have to use new terms, because this is where we come back to the sort of the phenomenology of it all. If you cannot start your entry into things that are objects of wonder, if you can't start that entry with just the basic common language that we all live in on a daily basis, if you can't capture that phenomenon with those words, then you're at a disadvantage already, and you're also losing your audience as well too. So that's always the objective, is to.
Yeah, and that can go as an advice, perhaps, to people listening that you know you can do it yourself. Try to describe. It's almost like psychology without psychology without the psychology. Just trying to describe your experience in the words that you're using daily without assuming anything. I think it's very helpful.
Yeah, and it's like that article that you recently wrote, that you were kind enough to share with me. One thing that people need to be aware of, particularly your audience, is when they're listening to people talk about philosophy, or they're listening to academics, or they're just randomly at a bookstore and they're opening up a book of philosophy. Um, that you always need to be aware that there is a sad sort of element of pride, of human pride, in wanting to simply sound smart.
Mm.
And the easiest way to do that is to use fancy words. Uh, Now, I'm of the opinion that serious people do not have to do that.
That's beautiful.
Serious and thoughtful people do not have to uh, sort of come across with pride or arrogance by using fancy language to describe the deepest and most important things that any human could face in their life. And so that's what I always like to try to tell people. As I say, when you listen to that person or when you read that person, does it seem to you that they're trying to talk to you in a very serious way, in a way that they want you to be able to understand how important it is that they're saying, or are they? Does it sound like they're just trying to be, prideful or arrogant?
Yes, and speaking about postmodernism, I mean, it's impossible not to feel this arrogance when you read their texts.
Yeah,
That they actually used, you know, um, language to intimidate the reader into submission, almost.
yeah, and that comes back to something that we've already touched on as well. Is if these people are serious about enlightenment, right? Because that's certainly what they brag about. Well, I don't mean to sound pejorative. That's certainly what they advocate,
Hmm.
is enlightenment. So if they're serious about enlightenment, then why do they have to seemingly present their uh, wisdom in a way that's so difficult to understand?
That's unenlightening.
Yeah, it's veiling in effect, right? I mean, it makes it almost impenetrable.
Yes, and what I never understood, especially with the postmodern movement, is that they did, like you said, not to use pejorative language, they did descend from the left
Yeah,
intellectually. Yet, they wrote in a way that the last people who could ever understand them are the common people.
Exactly. And see, if enlightenment is the goal, then it's the common people that you would think would be their audience. Otherwise, they should be publishing their works in just academic journals.
Exactly.
They shouldn't be publishing them as books at the bookstore.
Yet, just to throw an idea there, some of their writings, as incomprehensible and difficult and un-Greek as these are, they did have some kind of power as well. And I remember reading Sartre. There's a book called The Wretched of the Earth by Fanon. And I read this book back when, I was trying to get in contact with the Greek culture in a different way, perhaps coming more from the left than from the right back then. And, I tried to understand this colonial theory and what does it mean to be a colonized nation? What does it mean to have this history? We obviously were colonized by the Ottoman Empire, and some would argue that we never escaped as we passed in the Anglosphere, but that's again for another show. And so I was trying, I guess, to find equivalents in across the globe in the, in the fate of Black Americans, and Fanon's book was very high on that list, The Wretched of the Earth. So I bought it, and there's an introduction by Sartre there, pretty big. You could count it as an essay, and it's very interesting to read because what Sartre, he paints a picture, you see, where the native, as he calls it, he sits is. I guess it's like using the N word among the hip hop community. So he can use it. He can say the native. Well, we can't obviously, but he says the native paints this picture where the native is sitting around the campfire and they're whispering to each other, and then he turns to the reader, Sartre, as he's writing, and say, no. I can even imagine him with a French accent. He says, no, this is not for you. This book is not for you. It's for the native, the other, who sits around the campfire whispering in strange languages. But you can sit in, he said, you can listen in. And he has this seductive, which is clearly false. This book is not for the native. It's hardly understood by the educated Frenchman. Okay, it's not. It has it's exactly this complicated text that we're talking about. It's clearly false. Yet it has this seductive, draws you in that campfire that perhaps people like yourself and like me who try to combat this view and try to bring something back are struggling with. We're struggling to find this language that's going to draw people, that's going to awaken eros in people.
Yeah, and I think that ultimately what it comes down to is it's that's where you have the element of rhetoric that is very important to philosophy. And this is something that Nietzsche mastered just profoundly. Is that if you can speak eloquently in a way that describes something that others can relate to so well, right? That they can see it and say, "Oh my gosh, that's how I've felt, but I've never been able to say it that way." If you can speak that way, then we can win this, right? We can get our message across to other people so that they can at least want to hear us as an alternative voice to what people like yourself and me see as something that's very dangerous. They can say, okay, I don't know who this Athenian Stranger guy is. I might not even know who this Michael guy is. But what I do know is that I like the way that they talk about things. I can relate to that. They seem to be very educated people, and they're talking about things that I feel in my own life, and they're doing it in a way that's quite articulate, and I recommend it to other people. And I think that kind of approach is really the only way that we can move forward in this sort of war against you know, what seems to be civilization itself. I mean, it's very frightening.
Yes, yeah, and like I said, in case people think we're exaggerating, just you can look at how the classics are attacked in universities across the world. It's very sad, and yeah, it's definitely about, I think, finding the language, and the tangent, the thread that comes up is eros. There's something about that, I think, and I actually never thought about it perhaps before our conversation. It's a, somehow awakening eros, not necessarily in the explicit or degenerate way. Eros is deeper than that. So, what ways did you find to communicate that to students?
Yeah, what I like to tell people is when you, I mean, unfortunately, eros has come to be associated with the word, erotic, which is simply sexual. But that was something that was already recognized by Plato, Socrates in the Symposium. What I like to tell people is I say when Aristotle opens his treatise, well, not treatise, but his metaphysics, with the word that all people naturally stretch themselves out towards wisdom. What he's talking about is, and this is fundamental to Plato as well, what he's talking about is that the fundamental principle of what we would call the human soul is this longing for uh, something that we can't articulate very well, uh, but we feel, right? It's what is that deepest, innermost longing that you think seems to give your life purpose. That's all that we mean when we say eros. That we're longing for something. In the language of love, right? People would say, what is it that completes you, right? I mean, that's
Mm.
essentially what Plato's Symposium is about. But I think people can understand that. People can understand what it is.
There's a longing almost as part of, as a structural component of who we are.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
There's a longing in the way a cottage house has a thatch over it. It's not. It's a positive kind of missing. It's almost like you need to see it as a thing, as a being, rather than just missing something that just needs to be filled. Is what propels you, and you know, just on that notion, you mentioned the word soul a few times, and that's another word that has become unpopular, um, because it sounds so unscientific, yet it was an integral part of ancient Greek philosophy, without theorizing too much about it, right?
Right. Yeah. So soul has come to carry almost exclusively religious connotations in the Western tradition through revealed religions. That's not at all what I'm talking about. That's not at all what Plato or Aristotle are talking about. What they're simply talking about is what is it that, like you had mentioned earlier, what is it that makes us so unique, right? I mean, Aristotle wrote an entire uh, treatise essentially about this De Anima, right, on the soul,
On the soul.
right? And what it is it's that aspect of us that makes us unique among other biological things, right? Um,
Yes, and some people just listening to this title "On the Soul" from Aristotle might not read the book just because it's supposedly talking about something that's unscientific. But
yeah,
when he talks the soul, you can at least translate that as consciousness.
yeah. I mean, and think about the word. Well, at least it's sort of the Latinized version of it, de anima, right? Anima,
What animates,
exactly. What moves us, right? What is it?
what moves us, yeah.
And so, in that respect, you could say that soul is the nature of human of what it is that is the human being, right? Because it's that which uh, orients us towards all of our different activities, right? Whether it's
Mm.
merely biological, merely reproductive, or at the higher level, something very intellectual, right?
Yes, yes, and just trying to finish up about longing, especially, which is unfinishable. So it's a nice pun there, but about there's something that I would love your opinion, because I haven't had a satisfactory question relating to Plato. Plato seems to leave the reader in the longing. In many of his, especially early dialogues, you mentioned about prudence. I guess that's a translation of Sophrosini in Greek. No, Sophrosini is temperance. Yes, so yes. So in one of the dialogues talking about temperance, Sophrosini, the Charmides, which is one of my favorites. Go figure. And Socrates is talking about knowledge, and as the dialogue progresses, he tries to understand. He says, every knowledge is specific knowledge, like the doctor's knowledge is about health, the physical trainer is about the strength of the body, and obviously we live in a very fragmented society. We could keep piling terms. The computer scientist, the lawyer, they all have this fragmented knowledge, but Socrates says that if you want to be, to talk about the knowledge of knowledge, you need a knowledge, and this is going to sound like a mouthful, but here it goes. You need a knowledge that's aware of itself, that can account for itself, that knows itself. So knowledge with a capital K, real knowledge, understanding the whole thing around you, is not just taking the computer scientist and the lawyer and the doctor and just putting them in front of you and creating a system that encloses this. It's also adding that extra bit of that knowledge knowing itself, which is a mind twist. It's like the brain gets into a loop and Socrates doesn't resolve it. He kind of leaves you there. And I remember this dialogue ends with his interlocutor saying, "Yeah, he at least understands the problem of how difficult this reflective kind of knowledge is." And Socrates kind of nods and says, "Well, at least we can agree that if we had such a thing, this would be quite a wonderful thing to have."
Yeah, so Seth Benedetti has probably the most outstanding commentary on that particular dialogue. I'd have to think about it a little bit more, but this is my first sort of cut at offering a kind of response to what you're very rightfully pointing out is I would say this: um, many people, even people with PhDs, tenured professors, they often make the mistake of saying that the problem with Socrates is that he tries to say that virtue is knowledge. That's not exactly correct. Uh, Socrates himself never says that. One of his interlocutors at one point says that. Nicias says that. But the key to understanding Socrates, and this gets back to why I was arguing earlier that they always the definitive aspect of classical political philosophy is prudence. And the reason I say that is because what Socrates does say is he says that uh, you can't have knowledge without also having uh, phronesis, which is to say
Mm-hmm.
prudence. So uh, unless you have an awareness of prudence, unless you have prudence, you're not going to have comprehensive knowledge. Now that's a very complicated thing to understand because see the definition or the definitive characteristic of phronesis, which is to say prudence, is very it's a very high bar because what it means is that you know a particular situation, you know the particular solution for that situation, uh, and you apply it at the right time. Uh, the chiron, right? That's the key.
Yeah, and I think the Greeks would say that everything has a political implication. So going back to the student revolts that you talk about in the 60s, and and the intellect. We talked about the postmodernist and the Long March and everything, and so some of them knew less, but some of them knew more. I mean, a lot of intellectuals of these radical movements were seriously educated, at least in volume, if not, at least in quantity, if not. But they perhaps did not understand that these things would lead. That if you propose a theory like the postmodernists did, where everything is relative, good, evil, beauty, ugliness, everything. There's no standard. There can be no standard. People who thought there were standards were just deluding themselves, and most probably were authoritarian patriarchs trying to impose their own standards on everyone else. If you believe that, it's not just a little idea that you entertain. It's going to have political consequences that perhaps we're living through today. And that lack of prudence, I think, characterized all of this movement.
I would agree with that 100%. And sort of to put another spin on the postmodern aspect of it that we've been discussing is that this was the key critique that Strauss offered of Heidegger. What Strauss saw in Heidegger was a profound thinker. But what he also saw was that it doesn't seem to be easy to separate Heidegger's affiliation with the Nazis from his understanding of philosophy, because uh, for Heidegger took a very powerful stance on what, at least in English, we refer to as the will, right? Resolve, to actually just to not necessarily think something through, but just to make a decision and say, I'm sticking with this. This is what I'm going to do. Uh, and that's sort of essentially what Nietzsche brought to the table. And what Strauss saw lacking from that was a proper understanding of just how crucial prudence was for any understanding of philosophy, even and especially if what you're talking about is metaphysics. Uh, because there's a tendency for people to think that you can divide philosophy into the theoretical and the practical, right? There's somehow theoretical philosophy, which would be metaphysics, and then there's practical philosophy, which would be politics and things like that. Strauss's great achievement was to say, no, 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 no. I think that they're much closer related, and necessarily so, than most people would believe. And Exhibit A for my case would be Heidegger. This would essentially be Strauss speaking, as he would say Heidegger was a very profound thinker, but the mistake that he made was not sufficiently understanding the role of politics in philosophy. And you can actually see this very clearly in Heidegger's Being and Time, because in the introduction, Heidegger runs down this list of all the different disciplines of study.
Yeah, sociology,
Mm-hmm.
psychology.
And of all of those things that he lists, the only one he includes quotation marks around is politics. So that's so it,
Good catch.
yeah. I mean, I checked the German and everything.
Yeah, yeah.
It seems to be very clear that Heidegger has a very low understanding, or not a low understanding, but he thinks lowly of.
Of politics. That's very interesting. Yeah, that's not something that I would easily mark. And of morality, we have to say that he did not. He explicitly actually said that the philosopher's job is not morality. Um, yeah, that's very interesting with metaphysics, and we talked about the metaphysics of modern science a lot. And it seems that there's a regime change that is happening around us. And I think the reason why perhaps people like you and I get so frustrated, we can't communicate these ideas very easily, because the words themselves have become invisible. The idea of the regime, that we're living under a regime, always. The Greeks understood that.
Yeah.
Politevma or politia, they use. And just a little side note, we Greeks have the opposite problem that you have, because we know these words. When we read them, we use them. I mean, there's a borough in Athens called politia, which, little inside joke. I would say it's the farthest away from Plato's, but anyway, um, so we read a word like politia, which you can translate it as the regime, republic, and we say, we know, we understand what politia is, we understand what the regime is, but we don't. I would say, because if you ask people today what regime they're living under, they won't tell you, or they'll tell you it's democracy, and all they mean by that is that they go and vote every 4 years. You know, um, we're not.
Even worse is that just the word regime has somehow come to be associated as a pejorative.
As a bad thing.
Yeah, when people hear the word regime, they automatically think of a tyranny, and that's, this is another reason why I would not make a very good Greek, because I would be so irritated all the time that even my fellow citizens were using the right words and they weren't understanding that those words, which are their own people's words, they're not properly understanding.
Yes, and I feel some of that. I feel some of that. In what regime are we living under?
Well, this is this is funny in a sense because again, I know I'm a broken record on this, but I mean, I do have the pseudonym Athenian Stranger, so I will resort to Plato's laws. And in Plato's laws, he's having this long discussion with these two old men from different regimes about what would be the best practical regime for everyone to live in. And at a number of points, I think it's either three or four specific times in the dialogue, the Athenian Stranger essentially shouts out, he says, "We are living in non regimes." I mean,
In
yes,
non-regimes.
non regimes. I mean, the Greek is very specific. A polis, right? we are
Mm-hmm.
not living in regimes. And the reason he says this is because that there is an insufficient understanding of what it means, uh, what the word law itself means, and what it is supposed to accomplish. Right? Uh, that's and see, that's what makes Plato so timely right now. Is your very question, right? What regime are we living in?
Mm.
That's not exactly it's not a very easy thing to answer, but
It's not an obvious thing.
exactly, that's the most important part, is that it's not easy to answer because it's not at all clear anymore, right? I mean, you see people posting things on social media. I mean, you even read entire articles where people are saying, we live under a technocracy or an oligarch, whatever. And
Mm-mm.
so the question, well, not the question, but the burden is now upon us to have a full understanding of what these things mean, and also to be very, very aware of what our governments are doing so that we can properly understand exactly what we are living under, right? I mean, and is it a good thing, right? Is it a good thing what we're living under? That's what we need to
Yeah,
address.
and the funny, I mean, it would be funny if it wasn't so tragic thing, is that we all feel that we're going through something that at least you and I can call a regime change, yet we do not understand what is the regime. So we don't understand where we're going from and where we're going to.
Now, okay, now that's the key point, and I'm so glad you said that, because and this gets back to why it's so important. I always say to read, people like Plato and Aristotle, is because if you don't even fully understand where you are at, there is no way you're going to be able to properly understand where you're going, and even and especially if you think you know where you're going, because if you are essentially blindfolded, you might think you're walking straight, but you could very easily be walking in a circle, or worse, you could be walking off of a cliff, and that's the very real consequences of what we're seeing happening as we speak. Right? I mean, in my country or your country, we could turn the television on the news right now, and we would not see good news. We would. It's frightening. It's very frightening.
And I mean, just lately I've been realizing how, because my father watches a lot of TV, because he's not very knowledgeable about other media, the internet. So I watched some TV with him, It's our moment of connection, I guess. And it's incredible how snowfall can be presented as a horror.
Yeah.
You know, like that we had a temperature drop in Greece that would make most countries laugh because we're overall a warm country. It was kind of a sudden temperature drop, but hey, you know, you put on a thick jacket. It's, and it was presented almost like a zombie apocalypse kind of thing.
We had something very similar to that this past summer because there were some unprecedented fires in California over the summer.
Hmm.
And before there was any investigation into any of it, we had our former president, Barack Obama, along with the governor of the state, California, they were tweeting that this is demonstrable evidence of climate change.
Mm.
And then only a couple days later, it started to come out that those fires were set by arsonists.
So they had decided already what this event is going to be, which sounds very much like COVID. And again, I'm not playing the doctor here. I'm just, which we talked about phenomenology. I'm trying to describe the phenomenon, not of COVID, but of the COVID crisis as it was presented. And it seemed to me very clearly that the media had already decided what this is going to be before they had any real evidence back when there were three deaths in China.
And that brings me to something else that I want to reemphasize that we've both said in various ways here is that you and I we are not experts in climate change. We're not experts in medicine and virology. And chances are that all of the people listening to us, they're not either. All we are is thoughtful people who are looking at the world around us with our background in philosophy, and we're simply saying a lot of this doesn't seem to make sense. And a lot of the dangers and the consequences of the policies, they don't seem to make sense either. And so, what we're seeing play out before us is the debasement of the term expert because we have to rely on different media, various scientists or whatever, to provide us with their expertise. And so, what's happened is now that it's become almost a sad game of you know placing experts against each other. Say, well, this article from this expert says this article from this expert says this. And I think it's fair to say that what you and I are trying to do is say, okay, this is the situation that we are in. Everyone has to acknowledge that. These are competing views by experts. So we ourselves need to take prudence into consideration and say, okay, if things are this heavily disputed, what's not disputed? Well, what's not disputed is that we are witnessing a massive economic collapse. We are witnessing all kinds of unspeakable attacks upon our fellow citizens by citizens in the name of science that's disputed. And this sort of situation, this needs to stop.
Yes, and this somehow brings us back to the regime, and just not to leave, people just wondering, like, how can we use just what you said to understand the regime we're living under?
That's I would say I would have to say, at least from the perspective of classical philosophy, um, the regime is defined by the laws.
Mm.
So let's look at the laws. Like the regime can call itself anything it wants to. It can call itself a democracy. It can call itself a free society. But let's look at the laws because those are what tell us what the regime actually is. And if the laws are telling us that we're not allowed to go outside without permission, or if the laws are flat out telling us your job is not essential, but the person that's working at the liquor store is the cashier, his job is essential, then I think it's perfectly obvious that that's not a free society. Um, and these are things that have to be taken into consideration. So people need to look at the laws being implemented
Yeah, and I guess that's the proof right there that we are living under a regime change, because we're living under a massive legal change that is not brought up constitutionally, is brought up by as an emergency act, which, like we said, it doesn't seem to be going away anyway. So I think that's proof enough. This drastic reduction in our freedoms, for whatever reason, I repeat that, for what is a proof of a regime change.
And that's what I want to also emphasize is that what you just said is crucial. It's being done in the name of an emergency. Already in America, what we are seeing is people classifying other things as emergencies that need to be treated similarly. Uh, the left in America has decided that handgun violence is now going to be some sort of national emergency that's going to require similar laws uh, like what we've seen with COVID. And so that's right there. You already begin to see that once these policies are allowed to take place, they don't stop. So the
Mm.
people who are trying to say that this is only for COVID and everything's going to be okay once we get it under control, uh, they're stuck under the thinking of like what we would think of an analogy would be turning the light switch on and off. But that's not how politics works in the real world.
Yes, and I think these texts that we keep mentioning do give you an understanding, because perhaps technology is new, but the human condition is not, and the way it relates to politics and to power is not, and these people, the ancient philosophers, have delved into it deeper. I'd like to ask you perhaps the last question for today, and it's actually the question regarding technology, let's say. It seems to me that the only case, or one very strong case that one can make about the obsolescence, let's call it, of ancient philosophy. People who still want to say that, oh, these ancient Greeks, they lived so long ago. How could they know what we're going through today? One case that is reasonable um, is the case of technology. The one thing that the ancient Greeks did not, I think, philosophize too much is technology. Is technology something radically new in, or is it the same old in different ways?
Okay, so there are a number of places in Plato that I could point to, but in this particular case, I'd actually rather point to Aristotle's Politics. Aristotle in the Politics actually points out the possibility of essentially robots taking things over. Um, yeah, and he actually talks about the problems that that would cause, and then additionally, he talks about the first. Uh, I guess we would call him a political science who attempts to apply mathematics to politics, and that's Hippodamus. Uh, and he says that the problem with Hippodamus, and now Hippodamus is very crucial to understanding Aristotle's Politics because he comes up at the very beginning and he's criticized, and then he makes a comeback in the very end. And so that would have to be taken into consideration. But the point that Aristotle makes about Hippodamus and the changing of laws according to these kinds of technological things associated with mathematics, etc., is he says that the problem with when you change the laws like that, they lose they lose the power of tradition that they would normally have among the citizens. And once the citizens start to think, well, hey, laws are easily changed, then the citizens realize they're probably not that big of a deal then if they can be changed. Like what is the binding power? What's left of the binding power of law if it's so easily changed, or if it's changed for arbitrary reasons?
Mm.
And that's I think that would be the most crucial aspect.
But is there something in technology that constitutes technology, almost like, because if I'm not mistaken, what Heidegger thought is that technology has almost like an independent, has almost like a mind of its own, so to speak. It's almost like an entity that is has taken, not necessarily in a kind of matrix sci-fi way of machines becoming conscious, but not that far from that either. There's a lot of serious philosophers who thought that technology has is almost like an entity that has taken over history.
Well, I mean, okay, so there are a couple of things to say about that, but let me begin by saying that this is where I think Heidegger was exactly right. What Heidegger's most important aspect of his critique of technology is this: is he says the problem with technology is that it leads us into problems uh, that we attempt to solve through further technology. And so you have technology attempting to solve technology, attempting to solve,
Mm.
and so it leads you into this web of where you are in completely immersed in technology and you no longer even know how to find your way out of it. And on that, in that regard, I think he was absolutely correct.
So could that be something that the Greeks missed because they?
I mean, I think it's undeniable to say that they probably did not think that we would become a society that is so fundamentally defined by science.
Mm.
Uh, Now, I think that they fully understood the allure of that. Um, but this again, but see, this is where our project, which is to say what you and I are discussing right now, is
Hmm.
very timely because not only are we talking about classical political philosophy, but we're talking about postmodern philosophy, which is Heidegger. And
Mm.
so we can walk and chew gum at the same time. So we can recognize the value that classical political philosophy provides us, and we can also recognize the very important value that postmodernism can add to that knowledge. Uh, so we don't necessarily, and that's what makes, in a sense, that's what makes us postmodern ourselves, is that we can learn from what we have in postmodernity and postmodernity. We can
Mm.
learn from that, but we can also look back to the writings of Plato and Aristotle and say, okay, we need to incorporate their teachings with what we can
Mm.
also
Mm.
learn from our own time. Uh,
Mm.
so it doesn't have to be an either or, and I think
And either or.
that's where I tend to be most misunderstood. Is people would argue with me and say, well, you just think everything's in Plato, and I say, well, yes. I mean, I think that most things are in Plato and Aristotle, but at the same time, I'm not an ignorant man, and I have read, the majority of postmodern thought too very deeply.
Yeah, and sometimes I guess, 2,500 years sound a very long time, but it just depends on where you're looking from. Perhaps 10,000 years from now, they'll be wondering why we thought that Plato was old. It depends how you. I loved this discussion so far, and I'm sure many of our listeners did as well. Um, I would like to conclude this on that note. I think we covered a lot of topics. If you want to say something about uh, people finding your work or anything, I mean, I'm going to include all links underneath wherever this interview ends up being posted to have this discussion. But yeah, if you have a final word,
Oh no, I'm fine. I want to say thank you very much for just giving me this opportunity. And you know, uh, it's an honor. It's been an honor. It's been a very very enjoyable conversation. And I hope that we get to have more of these, and I hope that your audience appreciates all the great things that you're doing for them. To sort of bring these issues to bear on what we're unfortunately having to live through right now.
yes, most certainly. I hope your wish resonates with a larger cosmos. And so, thank you very much. I bid you adieu.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael.